I'm David Baker. I am the son of Everett Baker, known affectionately by his communities as either Uncle Ev or just Ev. I don't know that I ever heard anybody call him Everett. His great grandson has been named Everett, and very proudly so. He's now a 6-year-old boy of Chinese and Portuguese origin. Anyway, Dad was an incredibly important person in my life and remains so to this day, now many, many, many years after his untimely death. His background and sense of his youth, he happened to go to the same prep school that I did, or I went to the same school he did, Phillips Exeter Academy in Exeter, New Hampshire. And because of that, that had a profound influence on my life because my 4 years there shaped me as I think it had shaped him. The next year, his graduation, he went on to Dartmouth and Hanover, where he was very active in the Dartmouth Outing Club. And that's relevant because Dad was a man of the nature. He was a woodsman, in addition to being a minister. From Dartmouth, he went on to the Harvard Divinity School, 1925, 26, 28, and received his degree in ministry and theology from that school, which, as most people I think will remember, was very focused on Unitarianism as compared to some of the other faiths. His first church, actually, as an intern, if you will, was the UCC church in Boston, where his mentor there was Sid Lovett. And anybody who's of my generation and went to Yale University will know Sid as Uncle Sid. It's no coincidence that my brother is named Sid and my daughter is named Sid. This man was very important to my life as well as to my father's. And I think had a great deal to do with shaping his ministry. Uncle Sid, like Dad, was a man of the woods and was a woodsman, and both contributed to teaching me the lore of the wood, and that stuck with me all of my years. So in that regard, he was important to me. When he had his first church, he went into his first church in 1928, and that was in Providence, Rhode Island. It no longer exists as a church there. It ultimately was moved down south of Providence. But that church he served until 1965, I think it was. 67, I'm sorry, because I spent the first 5 years of my life living in the parsonage at that church. In 1967, a most unusual thing happened in the typical hierarchy. And here is this fledgling minister who was selected by the Unitarian Universalist, well, at that time, Unitarian Association of America board to be their new executive vice president. And so that is a position that he took, and the Baker family moved to Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts, which, as an aside, was the same congregation or same community served by Wastel and Martha Sharp. Now, those of you who ever saw the Sharps' war about their rescuing of Jews from Prague will recognize not only Wastel Sharp's name and his wife Martha, but also recognize my father's portrait, which shows up at the beginning of the Ken Burns video, just released a year or so ago. Dad played in that because he was the one who, having made a fairly consistent and constant search for someone to take on this assignment, a rather dangerous assignment, taking you to Prague in 1939. And he finally came upon Wastel Sharp, a friend and neighbor, invited him to dinner at our home in Wellesley Hills and put the question to him. And that's how that all happened.
It was the second Sunday night of 1939. I had done a full day's work at the church and decided to spend an evening in front of our fireplace. The telephone rang, and it was probably the most momentous telephone call that I ever received. "Hello, Waitstill." I knew whose voice it was, the voice of my closest friend, Everett Baker. "Would you and Martha come over to talk with me at our house here?" "Yes." He said, "Waitstill, Martha, I am inviting you to undertake the first intervention against evil by the denomination to be started immediately overseas."
My husband and I felt that something should be done. Refugees in the Sudetenland had been murdered, and people had been imprisoned and hurt.
We had 2 small kids, including a very tiny daughter. I said, "How many men have you offered this to?" 17, he said. I said, "Do I understand they've all turned you down?" "Yes. They think a war is definitely coming and they don't want to be in danger." I reassured Martha, missionaries leave their children. I'm sure ours can be left in good hands. I want to go, but I won't go without you.
While in Boston, 25 Beacon Street, which I remember well as a child, I used to walk across the garden and the green common up to the hill next to the Capitol. Dad took me across to the Capitol one day to meet Everett Saltonstall, who was the governor at the time. This was pre-World War II. It was probably 1940, 1941. I was 8 years old, very impressed to meet the governor. But I noticed that the governor's office was catty-corner to my dad's office at 25 Beacon Street, probably only 50, 75 yards between the two. And I suspected at that time, and the governor jokingly conferred, that when there was a big question that the governor had to answer in terms of policy, he used to wave out the window and get my dad to give him a thumbs up or not. That was at least in my imagination, and the governor very nicely said, yes, that was true. Among other things he accomplished at the Unitarian Association in Boston was the creation, along with several other ministers, of what is now the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, then known as the USC. And that has been an important part of Unitarianism since the late 1930s. Created at a time of refugees and wartime, but having continued on through decades and decades of refugees and wartime. In 1942, Dad was invited to come to Cleveland, and that was the beginning of his Cleveland years, 5 years there, living in Shaker Heights, commuting to 82nd and Euclid Street, where he had his office. And that was very formative years for Dad. Became very involved in a lot of civic activities. He served on the Labor Relations Board, the National Labor Relations Board in Cleveland. He sponsored the repatriation of Niseis from the internment camps in the Western United States. And for a while, we had Harvey Watto living with us. His family remained in a camp, I think it was in Oregon, for a while before they also relocated. But Dad made enormous efforts to be able to bring these men out of the camps and put them to productive labor in Cleveland, mostly in government jobs. And in Harvey's case, and I got to know him quite well, he was a very generous and loving man with a couple of kids that ultimately joined him, because they lived in the garage apartment above our house on Southington Road in Shaker Heights. Dad turned Channing Hall over to the Buddhists for their services, and much appreciated. And I can remember going and seeing how they had created modest decorations to enhance the hall to serve as their place of worship. Dad introduced me to a lot of things because he was very curious. I think had he never gone into ministry, he would have gone into design or engineering or architecture. And so he was always curious as to how things were made. And he arranged through the good offices of some of our congruents who were executives with U.S. Steel, the Plain Dealer, American Wire, Steel and Wire Company, the Cleveland Hotel. He arranged tours of these places and always went with me to show me what real life was like. And it made a great impression on me at that time. And to this day, I can remember vividly watching the steel being poured, the iron being poured, and the wires being made, and the newspaper being printed in all of these places. The extraordinary thing that had happened in Boston when he became executive vice president for the Unitarian Association was repeated again in 1947 when MIT invited Dad to come back to be their first non-scientist dean of men at the Institute in Cambridge. The story behind that is interesting and also has a Unitarian background in that the assistant provost at the Institute was having dinner with some of his Unitarian friends in Wellesley Hills and was decrying the fact that the personality, the culture of MIT had altered during the war. It had become a science organization dedicated to doing things like designing better submarines and better weapons and better aircraft and radar and ultimately nuclear weapons. And so at the end of that period, the culture truly had become sort of part of the military industrial complex. And the leadership of the Institute was understandably very concerned about this. They wanted to go back to pure science, as they rightly should have. And so they were casting around to find somebody in the science community who could do the job of making that transition. And at that time, one of the guests that evening who was speaking about this to the others, having laid out this challenge, one of the other guests said, "Have you thought of Ev Baker?" And of course, Mother and Dad and I and my brother, having lived in Wellesley Hills, the people at that table knew very well who my father was and had spent a lot of time with him, not only in church as congregants, but also socially and doing other projects in the community. And so Jim Killian on the following Monday went back in to seek to talk to Carl Compton, the then president of MIT, and suggested this very unusual step, and that is appointing Ev Baker to be the dean of students. He was appointed, and he served 4 years until his tragic death, flying back from Egypt, from Mumbai, India, where he had served as the chair of the World Student Service Federation, their annual conference. That plane crash destroyed not only his life, but to a large degree for quite a few years, his son's life. My son, I was enormously close to my father, which I'll share some memories of that in a moment. In honor of Dad's contribution, only 4 years, 4.5 years at MIT, the board, essentially board of trustees, I don't think they call it that, but at MIT, voted unanimously to name the new Alvar Aalto, the great Finnish architect's senior dormitory built along the shores of the Cambridge River Basin, to name it the Everett Baker House. And if anybody has been back to Cambridge, they'll notice a 6-story serpentine brick building, which sits on the shores of the Charles River Basin, and that is named Everett Baker. It's particularly fitting that it is named after him because Dad, in his role of "I wish I was an architect," helped in the design, giving Alvar Aalto some significant design ideas that were later on incorporated into the building. One of the most significant was the entire dining area configuration to bring increased amount of light through skylights into the building. into that room down in the basement of the Baker house. As for more personal note, and I think it tells something about my father, he's the one who taught me how to canoe. He taught me the importance of the J stroke. And at one time he preached a sermon about the importance of the J stroke as a way of maintaining and setting the course and changing course. As I said a moment ago, he taught me the skills of a woodman, how to light a fire with birch bark when it was wet. And I can remember the first time he ever showed me that, he actually pulled a birch log out of the lake, a lake in Maine, and peeled off the bark and started a fire with it. I was quite impressed. He taught me how to make a bow and arrows. And having taught me how to make the bow, he taught me how to shoot it. He loved doing things. He loved being with people. And one of his great loves were young people. In his period in Boston in the late 20s, early 30s, after he married my mother in 1928, he started a camp in New Hampshire, Camp Walden, on the lake by the same name. And it was paid for by a Christian group in South Boston that wanted a place to send children for a 2-week vacation in the woods of New Hampshire. And so Dad was hired with a couple of others. He became the director to go and carve that camp out of the woods. And even in the 1930s, he was still active in that during the summer. And as a result, in my very earliest years, in fact, it's probably my very first memory of my father, I can remember him walking up from the campgrounds to the old Swain farmhouse where we lived that summer, and sharing his experiences as running that camp, which was somewhat of a challenge. They bussed in and boated in the kids in 2-week cycles and had them. These children were all from South Boston, all impoverished and never had seen the woods before. So Dad introduced him to that, as he did many others in later years, to the wonders of the wilderness. His camp experience lasted into the 1940s and really almost into the 1950s, just before he died, because he still, during the summer months, when he could get up from Boston on long weekends, served as an assistant director to a couple of camps, one in Maine, the Camp Timonis, and a camp in New Hampshire, Sandmanville, New Hampshire, Camp Great East Lodge. I attended both of them as campers and one as a counselor. And I attribute to my success as a counselor the fact that I learned at my father's knee how to canoe, how to sail, how to swim, how to light a fire in the rain, how to spend the night in the woods in the wet. And those are all important to me. So that covers some of my very personal memories. What I came away with, and I carry with me to this day, and I'm not the only one who came under Dad's influence to do that. The woods were full of them, were full of them. But I came with a solid foundation of integrity, honesty, a true compassion and caring for everybody whom he met. Dad was a pacifist. He was an activist. He was politically accused, sometimes pejoratively, as a socialist. And as a matter of fact, we entertained some socialist leaders in our home in Wellesley Hill at one time. A fact that caught up to me later when I served in the Navy intelligence business. And I was interviewed by the National Intelligence Service about my association as a child with Eugene Debs. Dad was investigated by a congressional committee as a potential threat to America. So it gives you a little bit different cut about him to know those things. He was a true patriot. He loved this country. He loved everything in it, on it. and worked very hard to protect it. He would have been today, had he still been with us, an active environmentalist. When I was about 8 years old, Dad preached a sermon at the Wellesley Hills Church, Wastel Sharps Church. Wastel was away in Prague some of that time, and Dad, in addition to being the executive vice president of the UUA, or the Unitarian Association, took on the jobs of being backup to Wastel in Wellesley. He preached a sermon on Robert Falcon Scott, and he used as his text Scott's final entries in his journal as examples of courage, integrity, staying the course to death. And young Dave Baker was very impressed with that. In fact, I was so impressed with it that after hearing it and reading some things about Scott, I decided I was going to go to Antarctica. And so that is what I did in 1955, 56, and 57. I spent 14 and a half months in Antarctica. And the background for this presentation is, in fact, Antarctica, the Antarctic waters, a large tabular iceberg in the background, and some sea ice in the foreground right behind me. So it also had an influence on my life. You can see the profound effect that Dad had on me. And I'm not the only one. The last I'd like to share with you is a story which was probably more likely to have happened back in the 1930s and before than it would be today. There were many communities in New Hampshire, particularly, and also eastern Vermont, that were vacation communities for people from Boston and Philadelphia, New York, and they had summer homes there. And yet they did not want to give up their church attendance at the time. So they formed small churches, some of which were indoors in a barn, some of which were outdoors, some of which were somewhere in a tent. And so what they did to get ministers to serve those congregations is they had circuit riders. So ministers who were otherwise unengaged during the summer with their congregations would go up and go from community to community, sometimes just go up for the weekend, sometimes go up for several weeks at a time, spend time with friends or maybe congregants that had summer homes. And on one of these occasions, actually on most of them, when I was present, I would stand at Dad's side at the end of the service as he greeted the congregants as they left the church. And I always sort of basked in the glory of all the nice things that people said about his sermon and about him, and enormously proud of him. And to be able to be standing next to him somehow, I felt cast some light on me as well. And anyway, on this one Sunday, this clearly, I think a grand dame from Boston, probably lived on Beacon Hill, approached him, and she had a hat and she had gloves on, and beautifully dressed, and a bouquet of flowers on her lapel. And she said, "Oh, Dr. Baker, I so enjoyed your sermon this morning. And I enjoyed it 2 weeks ago in Rockport, Maine, and the week before in Sunapee, New Hampshire." Dad, of course, had to do that. He couldn't preach a different sermon every Sunday. And he said, well, I might as well use the one I used last week, and with the hope that no one was there last week. When that caught up with him, and not only once, but in overall 3 times. Educationally, he had no additional education, formal education, besides Exeter, Dartmouth, and Harvard, but I don't think he needed it. He did receive honorary degrees from Dartmouth College, his alma mater, and also Tufts University in Boston.
So you had sent us a painting of your dad. You said that one of his close friends or your close friends had done. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's hanging on the wall. I'm looking at it right now. It now hangs, I have the original, but a very highly resolutioned copy hangs in Baker House at MIT. The original portrait that hung there was done by a portrait artist in Cleveland. I can't remember what his name, but he's quite a famous artist, portraitist. It was not a painting; it was a photograph. And if you go around to various places in Cleveland that have pictures of local men and women, you often will see in the lower right-hand corner this fellow's name. Anyway, that was a very formal picture. Dad was in a three-piece suit, necktie, sitting in a formal back chair. It wasn't a comfortable chair. It was just a wooden chair. And he had a cigarette in his hand, which actually was unusual to see him have a cigarette in his hand. He didn't smoke very much. He did smoke occasionally, but very, very seldom. But in those days, photographers often used a cigarette as a prop to help frame their picture. Anyway, that's the picture that hung in Cambridge at Baker House for a number of years. When Esther Lovett died, she designated that the portrait which you have, copy of which you have, be given to me. She had painted that portrait posthumously, and she knew Dad for decades because, as I said, she was the wife of Sid Lovett, who was Dad's mentor in ministry and had been his wife for all those years. Anyway, I think because the number of times that her husband, Sid Lovett, and Dad sat around on the porch in rocking chairs smoking pipes, and the number of times they had hiked together, she knew Dad deeply. And I think that the portrait she painted captured who he was at the core, the basic Ev Baker. Another side story, briefly, it comes to mind when I talked about the Lovetts and the White Mountains. Dad took me on my first hiking trip on Mount Shikaroa, which is not a super challenging mountain, but if you're 7 years old and short legs, it's a couple of 3,000 feet in elevation gain, about a 11 or 12 mile round trip. So for a child, that's a challenge. And Dad took me to the summit, and I remember today, it was not a hike, it was an adventure. Every different rock we looked at, every fern we looked at the underside of it, every little stream we looked for critters under the rocks. And so this one series of discoveries after another. And in a way, I think of that almost as my life, a metaphor for my life and for his life. And when we reached the summit, it was the first time in my life that I'd ever seen the world. I looked out over this vast expanse of New Hampshire, and I'd never seen anything like that before. And Dad, it was very deliberate on his part. It was important to reach the summit so we would see the world. So that was another gift he gave to me. I don't know there's any place he ever went in his life where he wasn't truly revered, truly loved. Not loved, but more important, loved, not revered, because he was incredibly approachable. And he was one of those people that when you met him, everybody felt that he was their very special friend. There is a Everett Baker Foundation at MIT, which is well funded and contributes to a grant every year to a student elected outstanding member of the faculty. Not a popularity contest, but a student appreciation of the contribution that that member of the faculty made to them personally and their personal interest in them. And that's the key thing, their personal interest in them. Right. And so there have been a number of extraordinary scholars that have received that grant. Jackie and I met one a couple of years ago who studies black holes in the universe. And she lived in island community off of the coast of Australia. Ended up in Australia, going to the university there, and then ultimately going to Harvard, and then ultimately going to MIT as a professor. Yeah, I can remember fairly early in that time, and I don't know when exactly the church was founded, formally founded, but I can remember his coming back one Sunday and saying to his Helen, his wife, my mother, I was asked today if I could come. People didn't like the commute to 82nd and Euclid, and so he was asked if he could come to West Cleveland and provide services there. And his assistant minister would share in that responsibility. Wayne Shuttee, I think it was his name. Anyway, I knew Wayne quite well as a child because he also at one point lived in our house. We had this 2-bedroom apartment over the garage, and so that was housed by migrating military officers on their way to being shipped out, having been trained in the dentistry school in Cleveland, and it's said by Harvey Wato, the Nisei, a Japanese intern, and also by a succession of assistant or intern ministers. So it was a busy place. And so I think between Wayne and Dad and the occasional ringer that churches import from neighboring communities or even as far away as Boston, that's how it got started. And ultimately, it reached the point, and the same process applies today, where the UA today is able to certify based on some fairly strong criteria, strict criteria as to what qualifies to be able to join the association. And of course, that church that Dad served was at 82nd and Euclid, and long since now been torn down, I think. And the planning for the church in Shaker Heights on Belvedere Circle, I think it's Belvedere Circle, started when Dad was in Cleveland and was completed after we left.
And he was really responsible for all of that happening.
Yeah.
And encouraging people on the west side. And according to our historian, the west side of Cleveland was almost empty of residents. It was just beginning to grow after World War II. But he had the foresight to know that would probably be something that would be needed on the west side. So it's not like today where we're well populated.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you know that we named our social hall after your father.
Oh, yes.
Hall and
Okay, this is the book, and it has in it some quotes that I have used in our services on a number of times. And I'm just going to read you the titles of a couple of them. To Live and to Dream, Hope for Every Tomorrow. That was 1945, December. Starts out, the old year dies. Summer, Families, those are two. Families are for learning joy. Summer, we all have our hours of darkness, our moments of despair, but not so many times in the summer. And then one of my favorites, at Christmas we think kindly. And we have read that at many, many services at the Christmas time. And in my men's group, it's become part of our ritual. The week before Christmas, we get together to celebrate in different ways with